Hi, and welcome back to another podcast with Mr. Hagan. On this podcast, we're going to continue looking at tax incidents, and specifically, we're going to play around with the shape of the curves, specifically the demand curve, and see what happens to consumer actual incidents, producer actual incidents, government revenue, and deadweight loss when we play around with the curve. So what we're going to do on this first one is we're going to put the statutory incidents on the supplier, and then we're going to label all these things that we've done in the previous videos on this playlist: the P2, P3, Q2, consumer actual incidents, producer actual incidents, government revenue, deadweight loss. All of that, we're going to label that and draw some conclusions. What happens to those when the demand curve becomes more inelastic? So if you want to try it yourself before you watch me do it, then this might be the time to pause the video and then try it, and then come back and watch me do it. So this is the time to pause if you want to do that. Otherwise, I'm gonna move on and go ahead and graph all of this. So first of all, statutory incidence is on the supplier. So that means that the supply curve is going to shift up by the amount of tax. Supply curve is going to shift up by the amount of tax. And then that's going to be right here. This distance is the amount of the tax. And then we're going to find our new equilibrium price, which is going to be P2. The consumer is now going to pay a higher price for the good as a result of the tax. And as a result of the tax, they are also going to buy fewer units of the good. That's going to be Q2, which, remember, is our tax base. That's our tax base. And then to find P3, remember we go from the old supply curve, the new supply curve, the new equilibrium point, and come down to the old supply curve, and then come across, and label that P3, and then we can, from there, label all of our incidences. So this is going to be this P2 to P1. That's going to be your consumer actual incidence. That's the amount of the tax that is paid by the consumer in the form of a higher price. And P1 to P3, that's going to be the producer actual incidence. That's the amount of the tax paid by the producer in the form of keeping less. And then the government revenue, that's going to be the entire area, consumer and producer actual incidence. That's going to be your the revenue collected by the government. And then finally, on the end here is going to be our deadweight loss. This is going to be the deadweight loss. So what are some conclusions that we can draw? Some conclusions we can draw. We can say this: when a demand curve is inelastic, that means that there are relatively few substitutes. And the more inelastic the demand curve, the fewer the substitutes, the more inelastic will be the demand curve, and that will cause a greater amount of tax to fall on the consumer. The consumer actual incidence will be larger, and the producer actual incidence will be smaller, and the deadweight loss will be smaller. So let's explain why that would be. Well, first of all, the deadweight loss right here, that's going to be relatively small because the consumer keeps buying the good. They only reduce consumption by a little bit, so there's not going to be very much loss. Deadweight loss, because the consumer just keeps on purchasing the good. Additionally, the consumer is going to pay most of the tax and the producer is not going to pay much of the tax because the producer can pass the tax on to the consumer in the form of a higher price, and because the consumer believes that there are a few substitutes, they'll just pay the higher price. Okay? The producer can get away with it. They can get away with raising the price, and the consumer, they'll just pay for it. They'll just pay the higher price because they don't have substitutes. So when there are few substitutes, the consumer actual incidence will be larger, the producer actual incidence will be smaller, and the deadweight loss will be relatively small as well. All right, this has been Mr. Hagan on another podcast. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you on the next podcast.